Hello friends, welcome to session 4 of the Pilgrim's Progress, our final section as we finish part 1 of really what is 2 books in one. So I've said this many times before, part 1 of the Pilgrim's Progress has to do with Christian on his way from the city of destruction to the gates of heaven. So we are finishing up today book 1, then book 2 deals with Christian's wife and his children, and you are more than equipped now to read the rest of that allegory and to begin to understand and unpack that. We are covering today for our last session together pages 100 through pages 131. 31 pages, although this is the part where I've done the most substantial edits. Please feel free to read all 30 or so pages of that if you choose to, but we've edited it down just a bit for clarity and conciseness. And the theme of our last session is a very uncomfortable theme, and that is preparing for death. Years ago, I was speaking at a senior adult lunch, and my topic for the day was plan your own funeral. And I even had in big block letters behind me on the screen, plan your own funeral. And one of our staff members, who will remain unnamed, took a photo of me talking with our senior adults with these words behind me and posted it to social media and said, "Our pastor encouraging senior adults." He meant it to be a little funny, but I hold to that, plan your own funeral. I can't tell you how many times we gather together for the funeral of somebody who we know and love, and ask the family, what do you think so-and-so would have liked at their funeral? And they go, we have no idea. And so kind of in the blind, they have to pick scripture and songs and speakers. My encouragement is, plan your own funeral. Sit down, write a note, let your spouse or somebody you love know where it is. Here's the songs I want. Here's the people I want to have speak. Even if you send that to me, I'll file it. It makes it so much easier. It takes some weight off the family. But this part of Pilgrim's Progress is not so much having to do with planning your funeral, but with planning your death. No two people, boy, this is going to be a real pick-me-up session, right? No two people die the exact same way, and we're going to see that illustrated for us. And so what Bunyan, as a pastor and as a fellow follower of Jesus, says is, you need to prepare for death. Nothing in culture will tell you to do this, all right? What do we do in culture? What we do is we sanitize death. In fact, we outsource so many of the things around death. We move it away from the home and away from the family, done out of sight. We have euphemisms that we use for death. And I even find myself saying words like, pass away and go home to be with the Lord. And some of these are true, but we're afraid just to say the word death. And in many ways, I've seen a trend over the last several decades of beginning to ignore death. It's not unusual now that somebody would die and the family has no kind of a memorial service whatsoever. I think, and it's not for the person that's deceased, it's for the people who are still living to have that sense of closure and to acknowledge the reality of death and to acknowledge the hope of the resurrection. So Bunyan, as a pastor, he's going to do a stellar job, I believe, in this last part of Pilgrim's Progress in helping us as followers of Jesus prepare for death. How do we do that? We can begin to pray right now. In fact, when I go out to Clear Creek Monastery, one of the prayers that they pray every night is they pray for a peaceful night and a perfect end. That really is a great bedtime prayer, that as the day ends, you pray for a peaceful night, but also use the end of day to remind you that there is an end to this earthly life, and to pray for a perfect end. Also, we can make some determinations now about how we will choose to die when the time comes. Okay, so we're going to walk into this. Today in our conversation, we're going to experience 3 movements. We're going to look at Christian's final refreshment. We're going to look at his final challenge, in fact, final challenges, and the final state. And those are my words. That's not here in Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, but it really does encapsulate the movements that we're going to go through today. The final encouragements, or the final refreshments, the final challenges, and then the final state. Okay, so let's start with the final refreshments, and I'm going to be on page 125. Again, the last portion of the Pilgrim's Progress, and this is just a moment where Bunyan asks us as followers of Jesus to enjoy life. So much of the Pilgrim's Progress is, here are the challenges, here are the obstacles that you're going to encounter and that you're going to be required to endure. But through all of this, don't forget to enjoy the gift of life. And so Christian and hopeful, they come to a place of solace. They come to the vineyards. And at the bottom of page 125, they ask who, these vineyards and gardens, to whom do they belong? They are the king's and are planted here for his own delight and also for the solace of pilgrims. And so the gardener had them into the vineyards and bid them to refresh themselves with the dainties. He also showed them there the king's walks and the arbors where he delighted to be, and here they tarried and slept. Kind of reminds you of the Garden of Eden just a little bit, right? And life still has a little bit of that residual of the garden. And I think what is happening here is this is symbolic, this is allegorical, of as you approach the end of life, what will refresh you most is just to look back and to see the goodness of God and to remember and recall His faithfulness and to savor those things. Can I say this? These are the good old days. Sometimes we don't appreciate the days in which we live, but you're going to look back one day on these days with fondness. Now, you may be going through an especially challenging time right at this moment, but to look back all of life, and I'm kind of feeling this as a nearly empty nest parent, looking back with fondness. Were there troubles along the way? Absolutely. Were there times of discouragement and difficulty? Absolutely. But overall, to look back and see the big picture of God being faithful, especially nearing the end of our lives, we should remember, and by those memories be refreshed, and to see God's presence all through our lives. So that's the final refreshment. Now comes the final challenge, and I'm going to skip over to page 126. Pilgrim and hopeful are informed that they have two more difficulties, and in fact that first full paragraph, you have but two difficulties more to meet with, and then you are in the city. Then you'll be in heaven. Okay, your journey will be at its end. So what are those two difficulties? One is the river, and this is the river of death. And the river is often used in pagan mythology and even in Christian spirituality as a symbol of death. Crossing over the Jordan from wandering in the wilderness, making this long trek into the promised land. And so Bunyan here picks up on that image of the river. The second difficulty is there's no bridge over this river. There's no easy way to cross. And everyone must go through these waters and must go through the challenge of death. And this is where it's important to consider very carefully how we die. So I want to read again, bottom of page 126. Then they addressed themselves to the water, and entering it, Christian began to sink, and crying out to his good friend Hopeful, he said, I sink in deep water. The billows go over my head. All his waves go over me. Selah. Then said the other, Be of good cheer, my brother. I feel the bottom, and it is good. Then said Christian, My friend, the sorrows of death have compassed me about. I shall not see the land that flows with milk and honey. And with that a great darkness and horror fell upon Christian, so that he could not see before him. So here we have Hopeful and Christian. They address themselves to the waters. They start passing through death, and they have two very different experiences. So Hopeful says, I feel the bottom. This is easy. This is easy to walk across. Christian cannot feel the bottom, and he begins to lose his senses and cry out in agony. Here's a really pertinent question. Why does Bunyan have his main character falter right here at a key part of the story? Shouldn't he be inspiring us to say, here's how you ought to die, right? And he kind of does that through Hopeful. But what Bunyan is doing, again, as a pastor, he's not raising an impossibly high standard. He's not saying, here's how all Christians should die and here's how you are going to die. What he does is he says, some people pass through life and they pass through death in an easy way. And I've been with people in their deathbed, and they are ready. In fact, they say, I'm ready to go home to be with the Lord, and their faith and their footing is sure. But there are other people that wrestle and struggle. In fact, I've spoken before about going into the hospital room of faithful, lifelong Christians, and speaking to them, and they'll say, I hope I've done enough to get into heaven. They're wrestling. And at that point, I don't call into question their salvation, especially if I've known them over a long time and have seen the fruit of the Lord's work in their life. But I talk to them about what they just said. You hope you've done enough to get into heaven. I'll say, that's not what Christianity has ever been about. Your faith has never been about that. It's not about what you have done. It's about what Christ has done for you. God doesn't love you because you are good. He loves you because He is good. And the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ restores that relationship with God. And typically that light of recognition will go on. And they relax just a bit and they go, oh, that's right. I'm going to hold to that truth. It seems up to the very end that some people will struggle. And by the way, I have no condemnation for that, because I know that oftentimes as people are in those final stages of death, their mind is not clear, the medications are taking hold and confusing them. I get all that. But it's important now, I believe, to look at this scene and to look at our own lives and say, how do I want to die? How can I die well? And it starts today. Okay, this is something we need to be preparing ourselves for. So I think a pertinent question to ask here is, what are you holding on to? Oftentimes we have trouble dying because we're holding on to something, and we're holding on tight. And I know for me, as a younger man, I was gripped by the fear of death. I did not want to die young because I wanted my children to grow up knowing their dad. I mean, this fear gripped me. Until one day I had lunch with a good friend, and I don't know why, but I confided this in him. And he said, you know what? He said, my father died when I was very young, and I'm just fine. I turned out just fine. God had a plan for my life, and He fulfilled that. He said, Deron, you need to trust that God can use you, or if you're not here, that God will continue on with the plan for your children's life. Now, didn't go away in a single day, but that grip, that fear of death began to loosen as I kept giving God my children. God, I give you my children, I give you my wife. If I'm not here, I trust you to take care of them. And that was very calming. So as we address ourselves to death, when you say, what am I holding on so tight to? What do I need to start giving to the Lord now, so that when it comes to death, that transition will be a little easier? John Bunyan wrote this, not in the Pilgrim's Progress, but elsewhere. He said, consider, thou must die but once. I mean, as to this world. For if thou, when thou goest hence, does not die well, thou canst not come back and do better. If you don't do it right, you can't come back and do it again. Those are good words right there. You know what I think of? Sorry, I'm going to do a little Star Trek on you. One of the Klingon mantras is, today is a good day to die. We will die only once, and we don't know if it's today or tomorrow or next year or the next decade. We don't know that. But we want to die well, to commend ourselves to the care of God. So we have the final refreshment, kind of looking back at the goodness of God, the final challenges of crossing through the waters of death. No bridge across, you got to go through. Then we get to the final state. And my encouragement as you read the final, 3 or 4 pages here of the Pilgrim's Progress, just enjoy it. I'm not going to give a lot of commentary on this, because what Bunyan does is he offers a glimpse of heaven. And I'm oftentimes disappointed in movies, and I'm thinking of a few movies. There was a Robin Williams movie 20 years ago called What Dreams May Come. And it's about the afterlife, and movies typically make hell look so evil, and because it's so evil, it's interesting, and it's catches our imagination. And heaven is often depicted in movies as being so boring. There's clouds and there's harps and you're floating around. We get all that. So the idea that hell is more fascinating and heaven is just kind of dull. Bunyan doesn't do that. He makes heaven, as it should be, attractive. This is on page 128. Your walk and talk shall be every day with the King, even all the days of eternity. There you shall not see again such things as you saw when you were in the lower region upon the earth, to wit, sorrow and sickness, affliction and death, for the former things are passed away. And Bunyan just gives a rich description of that final state of heaven. But, and if I have one criticism of Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, he, from a literary standpoint, he kind of ends on a negative note. He's so positive, and then he kind of throws in one more minor note as he resolves the symphony here. He throws in a minor chord. But I think it's a necessary chord. Even though it doesn't appeal to me as far as literature goes, from a spiritual standpoint, I think Bunyan, in doing due diligence for his readers, needed to put this in. So as Christian and hopeful, they come to heaven. They are met. They are encouraged. They're carried along. There's one other person who's introduced, Mr. Vain Hope, and he comes into heaven. And as he tries to come into the gate, as he tries to come into the eternal state, he's not met. He's not encouraged. He comes in rather presumptuously, and he speaks as though he knew Jesus. Okay. In fact, he said, this is on page 131, the final page, I ate and drank in the presence of the king, and he taught in our streets. Okay. So what he's saying there is, I knew about Jesus, but he didn't know Jesus. And this is Bunyan's final pastoral warning, I think, to not only people outside who, maybe in the culture say, well, I'm an American, so I'm a Christian, not just outside the church, but even inside the church, to look very carefully, am I just acquainted with the ways of Jesus, or am I intimate with Jesus Christ himself? Do I know him personally? And then he says a frightening thing that honestly, from a theological point of view, I wrestle with just a little bit. But from a pastoral standpoint, it's a fair warning. One of the last lines, he says, then I saw, and vain hope is thrown out of heaven to hell. And he says, then I saw there was a way to hell, even from the gates of heaven, as well as from the city of destruction. So what Bunyan is talking about here is perseverance. That any point along the way, you can go off the right road, and whereas you think you're heading for heaven, you're going to end up in hell. From the city of destruction, any point to the journey, right up to that final state, right up until entering God's kingdom in God's heaven. And so every step along the way, we must practice perseverance. We are to practice living this day for that day. Okay? To know, not just know about Jesus, but to know him. And so this kind of concludes our reading of the Pilgrim's Progress. I do want to just make some walk-away applications from this. Just big picture, simple stuff. The reason John Bunyan writes this book is to help us understand the journey. To understand the journey of faith as we leave this world and as we're making our way to heaven. We're going to meet, sometimes we're going to meet giant despair. Sometimes we're going to meet talkative. Sometimes we're going to meet faithful and hopeful. We're going to meet people good and bad. We're going to encounter different things. We're going to encounter, the valley of humiliation. We're going to encounter the palace beautiful, the good and the bad. Okay. So Bunyan wants to help us. Again, a travel guide is a good illustration of this. He wants us to understand the journey. Sometimes, though, you won't understand the journey. You won't understand exactly what you're going through at the time. So, whereas we don't understand the journey, we trust God. I'm thinking of the time when Christian was in Doubting Castle under the tyranny of giant despair, and he remembers that he has a key that unlocks all of these gates, and it's promise. So he pulls out that key, and it throws back every bolt, right? So Bunyan wants us to understand the journey, but even when we don't understand the journey, he wants us to trust God and to rely on his promises. And then the final word is perseverance. Sometimes I think we take our salvation for granted. We say, I was saved, back on this particular date. And it's good to go back to that point in time. But to also remember, not only were we saved, but right now we are being saved. Right now we should be persevering in our relationship with the Lord, so that just as we were saved, we are being saved, so that on that final day we will be saved. And we will finally be safe under the care of God. But until then, we continue to practice perseverance. And I'll end with the words of Hebrews 12:2 2, it says this: fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of your faith. See him, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sitting down at the right hand of God the Father. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary or give up. Continue to persevere in your relationship with the Lord, fixing your eyes on Jesus until we see him face to face. Thank you so much for joining me for this study of the Pilgrim's Progress. Personally, this has been one of my favorite studies that I've ever done. We're going to let it live on YouTube, so if other people want to be a part of this study, they can do so at any time and read through this wonderful classic of the Christian faith. Now may the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you. And may God grant you peace and perseverance, both now and forever. Amen. God bless you, friends. Bye-bye.